Hello, I am Imoni Amarere. Welcome to the program People, Politics and Power. A little more than 50 years ago was the last time a United States president stepped down in the middle of a tough re-election campaign. In a televised address from the Oval Office, America's 46th president, Joseph Biden, framed his decision to step aside at the right time for fresh and younger voices. Biden told the American people that while his record merited a second term in office, nothing, including personal ambition, can come in the way of saving democracy. The 81-year-old Biden, in a bid to unify his party ahead of the November elections, endorsed his Vice President, Kamala Harris, describing her as incredible partner, experienced and capable. It would seem that the president's decision, albeit coerced by donors, celebrities and party leaders, was the right path owing to the renewed excitement in the Democratic camp that has seen record-breaking fundraising for the Harris campaign, a surge in campaign volunteers, and renewed interest in youth and women demographics. The Republican candidate for the 2024 elections, former President Donald Trump, barely 2 weeks ago survived an assassination attempt that drew widespread condemnation and a call to tone down the rhetoric that has dominated the race. Trump, who intends to be a dictator on day one, has refused to concede the 2020 election and faced a litany of court cases that he claims are politically motivated. However, while Kamala Harris and Trump are candidates who get the most airtime, independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is also in the race. The former Democrat, whose father was assassinated in the run-up to the 1968 presidential elections, poses a threat to the top contenders. For the Democrats, it is important that their margins are not destroyed, and for the Republicans, it is necessary to make a clear distinction between their policies and those of Kennedy. Kennedy recently got into hot waters when a conversation between him and Trump was leaked, as well as reporting that he was seeking a position in the Trump administration in exchange for the endorsement. Now, as it stands, there is no clear projected winner for the 2024 elections. While some analysts had postulated a Donald Trump and Republican victory, the race may have once again been thrown open with the emergence of Kamala Harris at the top of the Democratic ticket. The polls show that the race is tied and Trump's lead is within the margin of error. 7 battleground states are up for grabs. If the Democrats hope to win, they must hold on to Philadelphia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The Republicans are hoping to stop that. They are leading in other states such as Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Some of the big issues shaping the 2024 race include abortion and reproductive health, economy, trade and taxation, democracy, climate change, border security and immigration, healthcare and prescription drugs, America's justice system, foreign policy, and of course, NATO. By several indices, the United States 2024 presidential election is shaping up to be one of the most unprecedented in modern history. On People, Politics and Power today, we turn our attention to the global stage to get an understanding of these historic developments. And we have two guests to help us make sense of all of these issues. First is Dr. Clarence Luzerne. He is a political science professor at Howard University and director of the International Affairs Program in Washington, D.C. His latest book is titled $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice and Democracy. He's also the author of The Black History of the White House. Thank you so much for joining us. Also joining him is Dave Troy. Dave is an investigative journalist focused on exposing threats to democracy, based in Baltimore. He has a background in technology with an interest in studying online extremism. Dave writes regularly about information warfare, history, and politics. He is the host of the podcast Dave Troy Presents. Thank you so much, Dave, for finding time to join us from Baltimore.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Welcome. Right, the conversation begins after this short break. Stay with us.
Our dream, the Nigeria we need, is the united, indissoluble, and cohesive Nigeria which guarantees equity, fairness, justice, and prosperity for its citizens. That is our focus on people, politics, and power. It is fresh, insightful, impactful. It's a must-watch. People, politics, and power on AIT.
Thank you so much, Clarence and Dave, for finding time to join us. Let's begin this way, where it's typically said that a week is sometimes more than a year in politics. And so the last few weeks have been very, very epochal in the politics of the United States. So, Clarence, let's begin. Walk us through. Let us understand these very unique developments that have taken place in the U.S. this past few weeks.
So again, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be on with other guests. So a lot of the media dates back to the debate that happened on the 27th, June 27th, between Donald Trump and President Biden, and how that was a turning point given President Biden's pretty awful performance. I would go back a little bit further to the end of May when Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts. This is unprecedented in American presidential politics, that you have a major party candidate who is a convicted felon. And you put that with his being found guilty in a civil trial of sexual assault, and his business is being found of decades of corruption. So that really was where the Democrats were going to start to focus their attention. However, then we get to the debate. Biden comes across as this feeble and frail and confused, and it's just kind of stunning to the world, in fact. And it echoes what had already been, for at least the last year or so, concerned by even many Democrats that Biden was too old or not capable physically and mentally of being able to do another 4 years, which certainly was a line of attack coming from the Republican Party. Then you get game changer after game changer after game changer. You get the decision from the Supreme Court that essentially says American presidents, and in this particular instance, a lot of focus of attention is on Trump, have pretty much immunity in a wide range of areas. That leads to the judge in Eileen Cannon in Florida dropping charges against Donald Trump in a case where he's been charged with illegally taking documents. And that case was thought of as actually one of the strongest against Donald Trump. Then you get the assassination attempt that again focuses on Trump and for many of his followers, the fact that he survived that really awful, awful situation, um, and that he's divine, in fact, to move on to become president. All of this becomes victory after victory for the Republican Party and for the Trump campaign, and it's seen as kind of moving inexorably towards a smashing, overwhelming victory in November. I tend to think that the Republican National Convention actually mitigated against that. Trump's speech was seen as generally kind of rambling and uh, unpresidential. Um, but then the game gets upset again on Sunday when some people expected it, certainly not as soon, but many did not. When President Biden steps forward and says that he's dropping out of the race and then endorses Kamala Harris. So it's been a range of change after change after change on a really, really short period. But what it's done, as you kind of indicated in your opening statement, it's taken what had been kind of a lack of hope and despair on the part of the Democrats to a situation where there's hope and enthusiasm that did not exist a week ago.
Right. Now, Dave, let's look at the historic nature of the decision by President Joe Biden. Some have suggested that he took that decision maybe too late in the day, and that the power of incumbency is gone with that decision that he made to step aside while endorsing Kamala Harris to step into his place. Now, historically, is there any precedence of this nature to fall back on and to look at how it ended at the end of the day? Is this going to be, is it going to play out positively for the Democrats at the elections in November? And what do you think will be the defining issues in this race?
Okay, so a bit to unpack there, but I would say that the historical precedent that's most obvious is 1968, when President Lyndon Johnson withdrew his candidacy for presidency, and Hubert Humphrey took over as the Democratic candidate. And of course, that did not work out for the Democrats at that time, and Richard Nixon was elected. Now, I think, this year, this time that we're living in is quite a bit different from then, and so I think, it's difficult to compare that apples to apples. We have, as Clarence was pointing out, a lot of things are happening very quickly, and fortunes reverse from week to week right now, so we don't really know. And that was the subject of my most recent column, was that, it's impossible to predict what's going to be going on in November, because there's just so much opportunity for quick reversals and strange twists of fate between now and then. We've got a very active geopolitical environment with things going on in Ukraine and Israel. And so there's just a lot of stuff that can impact how things actually ultimately turn out. So, I think from my point of perspective as somebody that studies information warfare and how the internet affects our political discourse, one thing that I noticed was that, the coalescence of public opinion around the idea that Biden was, say, too old happened very quickly. Likewise, the coalescence of public opinion that Kamala Harris should be the designated successor happened very quickly. And it wasn't at all clear in the days leading up to Biden's withdrawal from the race that Harris would be the sort of presumptive nominee so quickly. One of my concerns heading into that as the prospect was that there would be a big, complicated open convention type scenario that would lead to a lot of infighting, which could damage the Democrats' prospects significantly. So, I think all of those factors are contributing. I think the history is instructive, but, it's, as they say, history, it rhymes, but it doesn't necessarily repeat. So I think, it's going to be a very dynamic next several weeks. I'm going to be at the convention in August in Chicago, so it should be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Now, before the decision by President Biden to step down, age was clearly an issue. The argument had been that Biden was too old and all of that. Now, the shoe appears to be on the other leg. Trump is now the older candidate. And then we have Harris, who's a much younger person. Do you think that the age card will still play out?
Well, I think, to the extent that Biden was definitely showing signs of age, I still, I think fundamentally that probably was overplayed because, at the end of the day, he was giving a speech last night. I think he's, got his faculties, but he is, dealing with the things that older people deal with. And I think, that is a factor. And so now that, that issue is now squarely being pointed directly at Donald Trump because he's basically the same age and suffering from many of the same kinds of issues. And it certainly will be by the end of a 4-year term. So, I think that this ultimately probably backfired on Republicans, and I think that was part of the calculus that Nancy Pelosi and other folks in the party used in trying to engineer this outcome. And, I don't think it was necessarily fair what happened to Joe Biden, but it's understandable, is reasonable. I think that the outcome is reasonable, and I think they now have a pretty reasonable pathway forward to move ahead with. So, it was uncomfortable, but I think the outcome worked out okay.
All right, Clarence, let's quickly take a look at the state of the race now in the last couple of days. The polls clearly indicate now that it's neck to neck between Trump and Harris. Before now, Trump was clearly ahead of Biden. But in the last couple of days, the polls are clearly showing that the two candidates are actually having a very tough one out there in the field. Let's look at the state of the race now and what it will be moving forward as we move towards the Democrats' convention in Chicago in a week or 2 weeks' time.
So the polls have been all over the place and will continue to be so. There's clearly what some might call a sugar high with Kamala Harris jumping into the race because for many Democrats and pretty much what finally pushed President Biden to step out, there had been a severe drop in support among Democrats for the president. They were not necessarily moving towards supporting Donald Trump, but they clearly were moving away. And virtually overnight, the fact that there was a Democratic candidate that people felt they could get behind is what the polls are demonstrating. We did a poll on Monday and Tuesday from a polling group that we have at Howard University of Black registered voters around the country. We polled about 2,000, and we had been doing polls all year. And we saw just a dramatic shift. 96% of the people we interviewed said they plan to vote for Kamala Harris. Now, again, that may change. In fact, it will change. The numbers are going to go up and down. And as David pointed out, there are a couple of nodal points coming that will have an impact, I think, on the polls. One will be who Kamala Harris selects as her vice president to run with, the Democratic National Convention, the debate that may or may not happen between the Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and between J.D. Vance and whoever. And in September, the judge in New York will also issue the punishment for the convictions of Donald Trump. So all of these will have an impact, not just on the polls, but on the election itself, as again, people kind of assess who these candidates are. We have no idea what's going to happen with Robert Kennedy, for example, who is polling in high single digits in many of the swing states. Will he stay in the race? Will he join the Trump campaign? It's all kind of unknown. So, but the thing that is pretty clear is that Biden's decision and the consolidation around Harris has certainly twisted the campaign to become much more competitive than it was a week ago.
And Dave, let me ask you this. Do you think that Kamala Harris is able to rebuild a strong coalition in the Democratic Party as in the lead up to the convention in Chicago, is able to, I mean, considering the fact that in the last couple of days, since her endorsement by a number of leaders of the Democratic Party, her campaign has actually kicked out to a roaring start. I mean, with a lot of groups, women, youths, and even fundraisers all jumping into the fray.
Yeah, I would say that the Harris campaign has very quickly amassed support from the, main luminary voices within the Democratic Party and across a wide spectrum of kind of far left and, more to the right, and center. So I think that there's really no issue with her building a coalition within the Democratic Party. I also think it's important to think about the dynamics of this particular race, which really, because of the extreme polarization that exists in the United States and which has developed over the last several decades, this is in many ways a referendum on MAGA and Donald Trump. And so to the extent that Democrats, are motivated to get out and vote, a lot of data that I have seen suggests that, they're not so concerned about which candidate it is. Now, granted, you want somebody that energizes your base and people are excited to vote for, but in many ways, what people are voting, for at the polls is against Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. So I think to some extent, developing clarity about that and making sure that the electorate understands what the stakes are is going to be really key for turnout on the Democratic side. And likewise, I think Democrats should think through what kinds of choices they might make that would enrage the opposition so much that their turnout is also spiked. So it's this in-group, out-group revulsion effect that is taking hold in the electorate here to some extent, and we have to be mindful of that as well. But I think the Democrats are well positioned right now to be very competitive on in the open general election, and I think that those dynamics in terms of getting a VP candidate that coalesces a broad base of support within the party, as well as doesn't come across as extremist to folks on the right. I think if they strike that balance, it should work out very well.
All right, Clarence, let's look at the issue of a vice presidential pick. Trump has already picked J.D. Vance. What do you think that will bring to the table or is bringing to the table? And where do you think Kamala Harris might be swinging in picking a vice presidential candidate, and what that is likely to bring to the table in this race?
Well, it seems pretty clear, at least in some parts of the Trump campaign, that there's a bit of buyer's remorse. So the week leading up to the debate, Trump had floated again and again that he was going to name his VP candidate. And what I think was going on was that if he had determined that he had actually lost the debate, one of the ways to shift the news was to announce his VP. But when it became clear that Biden was the story coming out of the debate, he held off. And as Biden looked weaker and weaker, and there were more calls for Biden to step out, and there was more dissension, then I think Trump felt more and more confident that he did not have to pick anyone that would sort of balance the ticket or that would address women voters or voters of color. He picked somebody that basically is a baby Trump. The problem with that, though, is that when Biden announced he was stepping down and Kamala Harris would be the candidate, then you create a very stark contrast between two white guys representing a party in a country with rapidly changing demographics. And on the on that side, and then on the Democratic side, a Asian African American woman at the top of the ticket. Now, pretty much is of the options that have been most floated for the vice president for the Democrats, it does include one woman, Gretchen, Governor Gretchen out of Michigan. But she said, and I've been a believer that she will not join the ticket. So some of the other names that have been floated, Shapiro, who's the governor in Pennsylvania, Cooper, who's the outgoing governor in North Carolina, Mark Kelly, who's a senator, former astronaut. So these are pool of folks that seem to be getting the highest vetting. Uh, Probably Shapiro, who represents a swing state, Pennsylvania, been progressive on a range of issues, but has also been controversial around Israeli and Gaza. And to the degree that this is really an ongoing dissension within the Democratic Party, and particularly among a lot of the younger voters, that is a more risky pick, just kind of along those lines. Um, um, Out of Arizona, Mark Kelly would be important, although Arizona doesn't represent a lot of electoral vote, but it would help. Um, Coming out of North Carolina would be important because there's a path to victory to the 270 electoral votes that are needed. That even if uh, the Democrats, even if Harris is the candidate and she loses Michigan, if she wins Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, takes her over 270. So there's a lot to be considered as they kind of calculate who they're going to pick. But they're in a good position. And Vance has already become controversial for a number of statements, and he's also unpopular. There's been a couple of polls that show that, and I didn't even know they did polls of vice presidential elections, but they did a poll, and Vance is basically kind of historically unpopular, kind of on that metric. So there's a lot going on, but it will be a critical decision, which will come within the next couple of weeks over who will run with Harris as her VP.
Dave, do you want to hazard a guess here who or where Kamala is likely to look at for a vice presidential ticket? Is it likely to be her decision alone, or it will be a collective decision of the party leadership?
Well, I think that, the way that these kinds of things always work is that there's kind of, popular buzz as well as just kind of like what the chatter is within the party and people that, have opinions about these sorts of things. So I think, Clarence outlined several of the choices that are currently being floated and which, I think are the ones that are under consideration. I would also add Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, to the list of possibles, again, because he's kind of one of these Midwestern states that kind of is a potential, swing type environment and could help bring, that state along for Democrats. But yeah, I think that the choices that Clarence outlined are definitely the ones that are in play. It seems to me like Mark Kelly is getting a lot of momentum right now in the chatter that I'm seeing, but I also am conscious of my own filter bubbles. And I've also seen a lot of enthusiasm for somebody like Pete Buttigieg, who is currently the Secretary of Transportation. I think, there's maybe some risks with someone like him. I think, a person of color as well as a gay man might be a little bit much for the right in terms of that might actually, goose their turnout. But at the same time, like, he's an excellent communicator and just a really competent guy. So I mean, I think the real news here, which I think people kind of underplayed, was that there's a lot of really good choices here. the bench is very deep, as they say in baseball. There's a lot of great talent to draw from. And I would also echo Clarence's remarks about J.D. Vance, particularly in that he is apparently the selection of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and some other Silicon Valley kind of libertarian types. And it almost looks like they're kind of running their own agenda. And Trump is going along with it because they've pledged money to support, the Trump campaign. But there's a bit of a fault line there too, which I find interesting, and which we may see develop into a more interesting, kind of outcome if there ends up being, enmity between those camps. So we'll see how that goes.
Dave, let me stay with you and to bring up the issue of the southern border, which played a very huge role in the election of Donald Trump in his first term in office. He has continued along that road, along that line, his current campaigns. And of course, the accusation had been that Biden or the Biden administration actually seemed to have messed up the issue of the southern border. And that appears to be hurting the Democrats a bit now. Do you think that this issue is likely to continue to play a major role in the campaigns?
Yeah, I think it will continue to play a major role. I think that the sort of perceived reality amongst all of the electorate is very different from perhaps what the reality in fact is, because this has become really a subject of information warfare. The Republicans make all kinds of assertions about things that are going on at the border, and the idea that Democrats want open borders and that the laws aren't being enforced and that sort of thing. And they're making these assertions often with no evidence whatsoever. But because of the information environment that we live in, those assertions go unchecked and get repeated and amplified and turned into myth and story and song. And I think if the Democrats have done one thing sort of poorly with respect to this border issue, is to not push back more forcefully and to get their own narratives out there about what's going on and why, because people just don't know. And I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about what is the actual issue with the border. Now, one thing I will also say is that the border issue resonates very heavily with Republicans because it gets at this issue of like purity and of being invaded, which we saw that in the kind of the COVID vaccine scenario as well. There's just something about that kind of scenario where there's a pure thing that's being defended by a contaminant that resonates really well for the Republican base right now. And Trump has been expert at playing that up and getting results from it, as has much of the rest of the party, other people like Jim Jordan and whatnot. So, I think it's an area where Democrats should develop a very clear line of messaging and, get a good story out about what they're doing, what their plan is, what they really believe. And unfortunately, there's, been chatter that, Kamala Harris was appointed as a kind of a border czar, and that all of this is her fault, which of course is a gross oversimplification and, not really true. But again, I think it's a very potent issue and one that the Democrats should get out in front of, because if they don't, the Republicans will fill the void with whatever stories they wish to tell.
Well, Clarence, let's look at the issue of debates. For so long, everyone thought that the debates really didn't matter much in determining who gets elected as president in the U.S., as in many other countries like Nigeria, for instance. But it appears that the last debate was what cost Biden the ticket and his decision to step aside. Now there is the expectation that there will be a second debate, this time between Kamala and Trump. Do you see this happening, and how is it likely to play out?
So you're right in that debates historically have not been all that determinate. You go back to history, you look at the debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. That debate was seen as critical because it was the first televised debate. And it was interesting because for people who listened to the debate on the radio, Nixon won the debate. For people who watched the debate and saw Nixon, who did not look healthy, who did not look well, did not have on makeup and all the rest of that, compared with the youthful looking John Kennedy, Kennedy won the debate. But following that, for the most part, there are memorable moments and lines that stand out, but debates really have not been that determinant. This debate was determinant between Biden and Trump because it was just a shock to the system to see President Biden, where again the issue had been raised going back at least a year or so, but had been stemmed a little bit because of Biden's performance at the State of the Union and some other talks where he seemed to be kind of fine and just sort of gaff here and there, but just kind of biting. But what was seen on the first debate was just an individual who, even if you love Biden, you cringe. And so it really was determinant, which opens the door now for the debate that may or may not happen in the fall between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Trump is already kind of signaling that he wants major changes. One is to shift it to have Fox News do the hosting, and probably many other rules. But as much as Trump sort of says he wants to do this, there's also a sense of this was unexpected. And Kamala Harris would clearly be a much more effective debater than President Biden, who I always thought actually was never that great at debating. And so it will be a most watched debate in history. Also, and as David know, debates now take place in the internet era. So every single line is instantly analyzed. Every single fact is instantly checked. It's a very different environment than even 10 years ago. And so for candidates, there's high risk going into the debate. So again, I'm not sure Donald Trump's team and Donald Trump want to open the door to what could be a real turning point again in the election.
All right, Dave, let me take you to another area. And this has to do with the electoral college system. For many non-Americans, this is one system that they are still trying to grapple with, try to understand how this really works in determining who the president of the United States becomes at the end of the day. Even when you have situations where a candidate has won more of the popular votes, the electoral college votes is what eventually determines who gets to the White House. Help us break it down for us how and what all of this means and what pathways there are for the two campaigns or for the various campaigns in getting the electoral college votes at the end of the day.
Sure. So the Electoral College is a little bit confusing, but it was built to try to reflect the same kind of power distribution that is present in the U.S. Congress. So it basically shares the same structure as the U.S. Congress. There's 538 Electoral College votes, which is the same setup that is within the Senate and the House of Representatives. So basically, it's an attempt to balance larger and smaller states and to look at population distribution, which is really the goal of the House of Representatives. So for each number of House of Representative members and each number of senators, each state has that same number of delegates to the Electoral College. So in order to win, you basically have to have a majority of the votes in the Electoral College, which means garnering 270 Electoral College votes in order to have a majority. And obviously the biggest states, California and Texas and New York, where there's a lot of population, all the East Coast states have a decent number relative to their size. And so, the goal is obviously to rack up as many of those as you possibly can, and to, beat out the opposition. So, as we've been alluding to earlier, there are several swing states. Among them are Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia. You might also add like North Carolina and a few others to sort of that mix. But these states are ones where most of the resources are likely to be expended, because the thinking is that, if they can maximize turnout there and minimize turnout, say, for the other side, then they have a chance of winning. So, and we saw that in like the 16 race where, that was really where Donald Trump was able to pull out just the slightest victory with, tens of thousands of votes in places like Wisconsin and whatnot. So, this is kind of the game. And so there's a lot of states that really don't receive any attention from presidential candidates because they're not considered to be in play. I think that, we're going to see that pattern continue where candidates invest in these, key battleground states. Like Nebraska, Nevada, also sort of in that mix. So at any rate, it's sort of the same old, same old. We'll see how it goes. But, as we've been saying, this is in this highly, polarized, internet-driven era where sound bites get forged very quickly and they start making the rounds. Fortunes can reverse very, very, very quickly. So we'll see what impact that has in these swing states. But, certainly that's where everybody's eyes are right now.
Now, talking of impact, Clarence, let's look at foreign policy. How foreign policy issues are likely to shape the fortunes of either of the parties or of the candidates. The Middle East and Ukraine are two crisis situations that the Americans have been drawn into right now. And there are, of course, divergent views, especially with the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday to the U.S. and the invitation by the Republican members of Congress to have him address the U.S. Congress, which, of course, scores of Democrats boycotted. What do you think would happen with these issues as to how they shape the fortunes of the parties and the candidates?
So poll after poll after poll demonstrate that foreign policy is never high on the election priorities for American voters if you do not have American troops on the ground. So in both Ukraine and in the Israel-Gaza conflict, those are important for people paying attention to foreign policy on everything from the commitment of American resources to human rights issues, but it simply does not rise that high among voters. Again, in the polls that we've done at Howard University, and we polled primarily African American voters, foreign policy comes in like 12 or 13 or 14 behind issues like housing, jobs, racial justice, police accountability. And in national polls, we see a similar kind of stake. Now, that's not to say that these are not important. And we saw when Netanyahu spoke, thousands of people came out in protest, and they've been protesting since October 7th around the country. Many young people, people on college campuses, for example. We haven't seen protests around the issue of Ukraine, but for many people concerned about U.S. alliances abroad and U.S. commitments to its allies, the Ukraine issue certainly important. Just a quick check back to the Electoral College. In a year where there's so many unexpected kinds of issues, there's a possibility of electoral college tie. As you pointed out, there's 538. After that, it's 269. Generally, you need 270 or more. But there's a couple of paths where you could end up with a 269 to 269 tie. So, for example, if Donald Trump wins Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, but loses the other four swing states, you have a 269 to 269 tie. That sends the outcome to Congress. The House of Representatives determines the president. The U.S. Senate determines the vice president. So the Electoral College continues to be one of these anomalies. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but it dramatically shapes our campaigns. As David pointed out, California is not going to get any attention. The Democrats are going to win. The Republicans are not going to put any resources there. Mississippi is not going to get any attention. It's going to be basically 7 to 10 states, but primarily these 7 states where all the focus will be.
All right, Dave, let me bring you in there. Do you think that, or do you agree with Clarence that foreign policy issues, particularly Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza crisis, are not likely to have very serious and impactful ramifications on the electoral votes during this election?
Well, I think what Clarence said was right, that, the people that care about those particular issues are going to be obviously moved by them. I think obviously the situation in Israel is very important to Jewish voters, and the situation in Ukraine is very important, to the, Ukrainian diaspora, first and foremost, but then also there's, a very large portion of the Democratic Party and a significant portion of the Republican Party that understands the threat that Putin poses and wants to push back on that and stands very strongly with Ukraine. So I think that issue does, resonate with certain kinds of people. But I agree with Clarence that, from what I hear from voters, the kinds of stuff that they're concerned about are Social Security, inflation, jobs, police brutality, the kinds of things that he mentioned. So, I think it's obviously, the electorate is very diverse and people have a lot of different things that they care about. But I don't think historically foreign policy has played that much of a role in U.S. elections, and I don't think that that's going to change now. But I do think that those particular issues are of special resonance right at this moment. And because, say, the Democratic Party is so attached to the Ukraine issue in particular, and as I mentioned, there is a kind of voting against the outgroup phenomenon. So people are voting against MAGA in order to support Ukraine in some cases. So it's a factor, but maybe not huge.
All right, Dave, let me stay with you and to ask you about the likely electoral impact of a third party or a third candidate in the race. We've just seen the entry of Kennedy in the race, and how Kennedy is naturally a Democrat, but we see him entering the race now. How is that likely to hurt the Democrats and possibly favor the Republicans?
Well, he's a very strange critter in this particular race because in many ways he's part of the same funding network as Donald Trump. So, for example, the largest funder, at least up until more recently, we think maybe Elon Musk might be Trump's largest funder going forward. But up until recently, Timothy Mellon, who is a descendant of the Mellon banking family, has been funding both Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy. And the only explanation that anybody can come up with for that is that they think that Robert Kennedy might take more votes away from Joe Biden, say, than Donald Trump, and therefore he's useful as a spoiler in the race. I think that what we may see happen is if new polling in this new configuration with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and RFK Jr. Indicate that he might be taking more votes away from Harris, or from Trump, sorry, then somebody like Mellon might try to pull Robert Kennedy from the field and get him a job, say, in the Trump administration. And we know that RFK has been talking with the Trump camp about a potential administration position. I would imagine that somebody like RFK would be very thrilled to have something like the head of the FDA position, which is a subject that he's very passionate about. So, I think there may be other factors going on behind the scenes there too, in terms of foreign influence and foreign money flows and things like that, and we can only speculate about that right now. But I think that the other question is just how many states Robert Kennedy will be on the ballot in, and whether those states matter. I haven't tracked that matter closely. Maybe Clarence has. But, I think he has the potential to be damaging, and we're not sure to whom yet. But he won't win. I don't think anybody thinks he's going to win.
Clarence, what's your take on that?
No, so Dave is exactly right that right now it looks like he may be equally damaging to both candidates. And again, third-party candidates generally play more of a spoiler role, but don't really have a chance. There have been candidates in the past that actually won state, Goldwater and George Wallace, but for the most part, simply no state that you can see Robert F. Kennedy winning. Kennedy actually had won, or at least was polling, I won't say super well, but he was polling among older Black voters earlier in the year. But that has dramatically changed. So there's not any path for him to win, even I think a single state. And again, the Trump campaign, I think now is worried because there is some evidence that he actually will be taking some votes away from Donald Trump. There are other independent candidates that are running, Cornel West and a few other people, but they are polling low single numbers. So it could be critical if you're really talking, a few thousand votes that determine the winner in some of these swing states. But that, remains to be seen. But I think at this point, the nation really is moving towards the two primary candidates. Democrats literally a week ago were just in despair. And just in my lifetime, I've never seen such a remarkable kind of turnaround because, again, it's actually not about as much the Democratic Party as much as stopping the MAGA movement and stopping Donald Trump. And so I was in France for the recent elections, and again in the second round, the left, which included progressives all the way over to the hard left, came together because they had such a fear for national rally and the far right coming to power. And there's a little bit of that kind of going on in the Democratic Party right now.
All right, thank you so much, Luzan. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. We hope to get back to you again before the November elections, and of course, we'll be able to appraise more appropriately what the situation will be. Clarence Luzan, political science professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., United States. Thank you so much. And David Troy is a columnist and investigative journalist at the Washington Spectator. Thank you so much, Dave, for your time. And thank you for investing your time with us there. We look forward to being with you again when we bring you a fresh edition of the program, People, Politics, and Power. Bye for now.